This is an interesting topic. What causes anti-Semitism? Now, there's two ways of looking at this. There's the secular perspective, and there's a Torah perspective. I'm first going to go over the secular perspective. What caused anti-Semitism? If you look at the beginning of time, during the ancient Greek time, there are some very references of anti-Jewish, I should say. Anti-Semitism is Semites are a group of people that are nomads, but for our sake, anti-Semitism will mean against Jews. So there's many anti-Semitic literature during the ancient Greek times, which is the first recorded anti-Semitic writings. And many of these anti-Semitic ideas were basically based on because the Jews wouldn't accept the Hellenistic ideas that the Greeks carried on. And these ideas were, having crazy orgies and sex with a bunch of people. It had to do with also the idea of different things from Jews not being circumcised that Greeks saw as barbaric. Different cultural ideas that Greeks found different, which was later brought on to the Romans. The modern anti-Semitism that we see is which started actually in the Middle Ages. After the fall of the Roman Empire, there were Jews throughout southern France and northern France, which was later known as the Ashkenazim. The reason why it's called they call it the Ashkenazim is because they remained on the Rhineland. And that Rhineland in Hebrew was termed Ashkenaz, so they're called Ashkenazi Jews. So the reason why anti-Semitism happened in the modern era, and what was the cause of it, is that Jews were restricted to several jobs that they could do. One of the jobs they were allowed to do was money lending. And this is where the stereotype of the money lending Jew comes out. Now, the issue with money lending was that they were contracted by kingdoms and different feudal lords, kings, and they would loan money to the king. The king would give them money, and then they'd loan that out to the peasants. Now, the thing is, the king would charge them a 5% interest, and they again would charge the people 10% in order to cover that 5%. And this is just one example of a feudal system. Sometimes it was more 20 or 30% the Jews would charge, and that would only be because they had to pay the king half of that percentage. So many people in the village, instead of being angry at the king, were angry at the Jews because they would charge huge interest rates. But of course, this was all done in order so they could make a profit. So what happened is many of these people would get, of course, angry, and they'd burn houses down, and they'd blame all their financial problems on the Jews. So in order to erase their credit, they would go off and they would burn Jewish homes. Now, that's one reason for anti-Semitism in a secular perspective. Another reason is the fact that they were very different. They spoke a different language than the people that lived in that area. So they were seen as outsiders. Mostly focusing on Eastern Europe right now and Western Europe. They didn't speak German. They didn't speak English. They didn't speak Polish. They didn't speak Russian. They spoke Yiddish. They had a very different customs in the way they slaughtered animals. They were just totally different from another person, from any other ordinary Pole or Russian. So the people, since there wasn't minorities other than Jews, they would, besides the gypsies, the Jews were seen as the lowest because, number one, they rejected the idea of Christ. So people would have these different ideas of what Jews were. They didn't really know too much about them. So what they would do is they come up with different ideas and stories to try to understand them. One of these ideas was the blood libel, which was brought up in 1215, or something more than the 1200s in England, where a young Christian boy was killed, and the Jews were suspected in taking his blood to make matzah. Now, this is the modern blood libel. There's actually another blood libel, which was in the 1800s. You can look it up. It's called the Damascus blood libel, where a Christian boy was found killed in Syria, and Jews were suspected of killing him to make matzah. Now, this was all fabricated and nonsense because they didn't really understand Jews very well, and that Jews can't even drink blood at all. They have to have blood completely separated from anything at all. So they didn't really understand that. So the whole idea of anti-Semitism in the modern era is mostly based on their history in money lending, and also the idea that they were very different and they were a minority. People didn't fear minorities and understand them very well because they were very different. So in doing so, they were treated very differently and they were understandable. But now there's a Torah perspective to understand anti-Semitism. Now, the Torah perspective tells us that as the Jews went further away from Torah, they were punished by God, and this was the result of anti-Semitic attacks on Jews. You can see this through pogroms. You can see this through the expulsion from Spain. You can see this through several means. And the reason why they messed up was the mistreatment of how they treated each other. If you look back in the times of the Baal Shem Tov, which was the founder of the Hasidic movement, there were Jews who treated other Jews differently based on how much they knew. And obviously this didn't make God happy, so he punished the Jews for that. And of course, there were other times later during the 1800s where Jews tried to get rid of their Judaism and their Torah completely, and were trying to adopt and assimilate completely into the culture. And this was called the Haskalah movement, whereby Jews found themselves enlightened. They tried to change Judaism in order to blend into society and make it more of a religion rather than a nation. And this I'll discuss in a future video. But overall, their blasphemy and heresy that they produced, God punished them with anti-Semitism, ultimately the Holocaust. And the reason why anti-Semitism continues is because of Jews' failure to follow Torah. Now, this I'll tell you in a later video. So, in a nutshell, anti-Semitism is caused both by Jews and also by the perspectives of other Gentiles and how they view Jews. Now, that's the secular perspective, and that's the Torah perspective on the cause of anti-Semitism. I could go further in, but what I would suggest to someone who's interested is to look up the Dreyfus Affair for any interesting reference. Look up the Rothschilds. They were one of the richest banking families who were Jews. They led to many kings, and the reason why we use checks is because they invented the checkbook, whereby they would transfer money from one place to another. They would be robbed by people that were on the street. So what they do is they'd write a check, and they'd walk from one bank to another, so that someone would just come by. They didn't think they had anything. They'd go up to that bank, and they'd have that money switched back to the other one using the check. Another thing to look into is anti-Semitism in the classical age, as well as the medieval blood libels, the one in the 1200s, and you should find more information about it. If anyone has any questions or wants me to go further on anti-Semitism, I will. It's a very broad topic. If you'd like, I can touch on some very specific ones that anyone has questions on. So please be free to comment. So, have a great day, and hope you enjoy the video.